I'm having trouble with the video.
You are on, ma'am. You can start.
Am I? Okay.
Today is a celebration for you, dear readers and book lovers, and for me, who discovered a prodigiously talented writer when I first read him nearly 20 years ago. One of the finest writers of our times, he has illumined my understanding of the human condition and earned my admiration for over 2 decades, perhaps like no other writer. A hearty welcome to you all. I'm Dr. Julie Mehta, and on behalf of the Bengal Club Subcommittee, the chair of the subcommittee, Dr. Shondeep Chatterjee, and the president of the club, Mr. Ambrose Gupta, I am delighted to have the pleasure of your company and contribution on this rather special evening. Our author for our book club meet today is Philip Michael Ondaatje, a Sri Lankan Canadian writer and poet born on September 12, 1943 in Colombo, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, which makes this his 78th birthday. Ondaatje is a filmmaker, a poet, a fiction writer, and many other things besides. His dazzling oeuvre is rooted in his ability to see hope and practice kindness through a fractured childhood and stupendously challenging growing up years when he was left behind with his father in Sri Lanka at the age of 5 by his parents' divorce. His fragmented life finds an inventive invocation through the different genres he embraces in his texts. In this memoir that we are up for exploration today, running in the family, the diary, the journal, poetry, conversations, history, fiction, truth, manipulated truths, photographs, tape recorders, all come together in a kind of a tossed salad, like his own life. Written when he was going through a breakup with his first wife, with whom he has 2 children, the memoir is testimony to Ondaatje's need to remember, relocate, and resurrect family ties. Michael Ondaatje's earliest years were spent on the Kutapitiya tea estate, and I quote, "the most beautiful place in the world," as he says, in the last era of colonial Ceylon, before the estates were nationalized. Though his memoir depicts the paradisical days of a westernized elite, where nobody really had to grow up, they remained wild and spoiled, as he says, he describes his family as, and I quote, "on the edge of hard times." His brother, Christopher, a businessman and an explorer, and might I add, in lived experience, I have seen what a great philanthropist he is and a supporter of the arts. He gave us enough funding at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto to build a completely new wing, the South Asian Christopher Ondaatje wing. Michael says it was probably easier for me than for my brothers and sisters because I was the youngest. Their mother, Doris Gratian, was given to dancing in the style of Isadora Duncan. His father, Mervyn Ondaatje, was in the Ceylon Light Infantry and supervised a tea plantation before losing jobs through alcoholism. My father, he says, was in tea and alcohol. He dealt in tea and he drank the alcohol. In one poem, Ondaatje wrote of the terrifying comedy of his father's life. And I quote, "My mother divorced him again and again. He would rush into tunnels magnetized by the white eye of trains." At 1911, Michael Ondaatje went to join his mother in the UK and immigrated to Montreal when he was 19 and received a BA in English from the University of Toronto in 65 and an MA from Queen's University, Canada in 67. Then he taught at York University for a while. Ondaatje crafts his works from a rich blend of myth, history, jazz, memoirs, and other forms. His first collection of poetry, The Dainty Monsters, was written and published in 67 when he was only 23 years old. In his long poem, The Man with Seven Toes, 1969, Ondaatje uses Orthodox history to create a raw landscape of bodies blurred between unity and disunity. Then there was the collected works of Billy the Kid, Left-Handed Poems, Rat Jelly, The Dainty Monsters, Secular Love, The Cinnamon Peeler, and my favorite, Handwriting. More recently, he returned to poetry with the publication of his long poem, The Story. Ondaatje's prose works, perhaps, are better known than his poetry. Coming Through Slaughter, some of you might remember, a novel about the descent into the insanity of the New Orleans jazz musician Buddy Bolden's crowd. Running in the Family, which is up today, 1982, his memoir about his life in Ceylon, and In the Skin of a Lion, 87, a novel about the clash between rich and poor, the marginalized and the central Anglo-Canadian in early 20th century Toronto. Two characters from Skin of a Lion are resurrected in The English Patient, which most of you would know, which won the Golden Booker, 1992 published, and the film version was 1996. And then subsequent novels, Anil's Ghost in 2000, set in Sri Lanka amid the political violence, of which Dr. Harish Mehta will talk to us a little bit, and De Visadero in 2007. The Cat Stable in 2011, about that ride all the way across to England from Sri Lanka on a ship all alone. In Warlight in 2018, a teenage boy and his sister are left with two mysterious men as their parents moved to Singapore after the Second World War. He is a celebrity author, and has won multiple literary awards, such as the Governor General's Award several times, the Giller Prize, the Booker Prize twice, and the Order of Canada, recognizing him as one of Canada's most renowned living authors. In addition to his literary writing, what is most endearing about Ondaatje is that he's been an important force in fostering new Canadian writing. With 2 decades of commitment to Coach House Press and his editorial credits on Canadian literary projects like the journal Brick. Ondaatje is perhaps one of Canada's most influential contemporary writers and one of the country's biggest cultural exports, as we shall see with all your wonderful contributions today. He is best known as a novelist, partly due, I suppose, to the phenomenal success of The English Patient and Anil's Ghost. But he first achieved critical acclaim as a poet. In the end, Ondaatje is best understood, not just as a poet or a novelist or as a filmmaker, but as a consummate artist who has explored the very limits of these genres. I want to show you a few images, as we always do, share amongst us, puts us in the mood and in the picture. So our techie wizard, Mr. Gurudas Mitro, may we start? Hello, Anju, lovely to see you. Gurudas, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. I'm just
Okay.
sharing it in a moment.
All right. So as we get into the images, I wanted to share with you why I say, after 20 years of reading, researching, and teaching his work, why I feel that he is one of the writers who has illuminated my teaching career, my research, my publications. First, I will share with you on the first reading of Running in the Family with undergraduate students in a class at the University of Toronto. 2008 was the year, and I won't forget the day.
Is my screen, you can view my screen, ma'am?
Yes, thank you so much, Gurudash. Perfect. Can you all see everything? Okay.
Perfectly, thanks.
Thank you. So this student was a South Asian student, very promising scholar. And I had asked her to read the last 2 paragraphs of Running in the Family before we started the novel, because I do believe in conversations, in interviews, and by reading his novels, we realize that the absent father is a huge presence in all his works, whether it's poetry or whether it's pretty much any of his oeuvres. And what Miss Virani did in my class was within the first 2 lines, she broke down. The understated Ondaatje, with his trip back almost 25 years after he left Sri Lanka, his remembering, as you can see on the top of the slide on your right, that's his father, Mr. Mervyn Ondaatje, brilliant man, could quote Shakespeare line and verse, and you know, was so familiar that they called him, they heralded him as the great understudy of the bard in Ceylon at parties. In the Burgher community, he was very well known to be a polished and a very savvy gentleman who'd returned from Cambridge without a degree because he loved the champagne too much. He'd rather have champagne parties at 11 in the morning than go for his classes. But the point that came home to me that day was Miss Virani in my class was not the only student or the only reader who was moved to tears by the invocation of the absent father. So according to family law, a Tamil forebear from South India who was a doctor healed the Dutch governor and was rewarded, the Dutch governor's daughter, and was rewarded with a Dutch wife and the spelling of the Dutchman's name, which was Ondaatje. We'll hear more about the Burgher community from Harish, but the interesting part is that this man from South India was a Chettiar, the Chettiar community, and he came in the 1600s. And so Ondaatje's lineage does go back a long way. And it is a pretty mixed one. And he says himself, I am more like a salad than anything else. So you can see how close we are to Sri Lanka, and the proximity brings about a linguistic, epistemic connection that even the Tamil Tigers understood to be precious enough to give their lives for. Thank you, Gurudash. Next one. So at the age of 5, Ondaatje's parents separated, and the following year, his mother moved to England with his brother Christopher, sister Janet. He and his sister Gillian stayed in Ceylon with aunts and uncles. And Ondaatje joined his mother in the UK at the age of 11. Ondaatje's mother was a very venerated hotelier in Ceylon, and she took those skills to keep her young family afloat while working in hotels in the UK. Ondaatje says when he moved to England, he became so preoccupied with trying to acculturate to the English way of life that it was easy for him to put the nostalgia behind him. Next one, Gurudas, please. So this again is Mervyn Ondaatje, who keeps making an appearance right through all his novels. And as I said, there was a lot to know about him. He was a mercurial man, brilliant, and a die-hard alcoholic. And because this was an impossible situation, he fell down and had a brain hemorrhage and he died. And I think perhaps Jean Everett, who is, who has done a fair bit of research and knows this idea of finding an intertextuality in the last few pages of Running in the Family. It is really up to her if she would like to make a few comments at the end of our meeting. But in any case, you'll get a chance to hear her in a conference that is coming up. We'll tell you about that later. So every night I cut out my heart, but in the morning it was full again. This is from the English Patient, Al-Mashi. But I do feel that this suturing of the sorrow, the pain, the loneliness, the separation that he felt by being taken away and not seeing his father alive after he left Sri Lanka is what brings about this enormous expression of separation. Next, please, Gurudas. So I want to put this for us in a kind of a refreshing, through a refreshing lens. So if we look at Sigmund Freud's family romances, we see that he says the whole effort at replacing the real father by a surrogate one is only an expression of the child's longing for the happy days when his father seemed to him the noblest and the strongest person alive, and the mother the dearest and loveliest of women. He is turning from the father whom he knows today to the father whom he believed in the earlier years of his childhood. In my reading, there are several schools of thought on this, but in my reading of my Running in the Family and in my understanding, there is no blame on the father figure. Rather, there is a great sorrow. In Rat Jelly, for instance, Letters from Other Worlds, there is this great sadness. My father's fear. My father's body was a globe of fear. There was so much that he wanted to fill in the hollows of what he'd lost with his father. Yes, please. Next one. So I want to quote a senior colleague and a specialist on the poetry of Michael Ondaatje, Sam Solecki from the University of Toronto. The great hurt of everything is also at the heart of Ondaatje's vision. Though we can often narrow it down to the essential underlying donné, which is the breakup of his parents' marriage, their divorce, and his subsequent childhood exile from Ceylon in 1954, an exile that also included a permanent separation from his father, Philip Mervyn Ondaatje, which is what we talked about. And this is his home for the last so many years, since he was in his early 20s. Michael Ondaatje lives in Toronto, Gerrard Street, with his wife, Linda Spalding, with whom he edits the literary journal Brick. Next one, please. So just to keep it very sharp, in Running in the Family, about the running in the family, he says, it wasn't so much ignoring as having to survive in the West. I realized I had slipped past a childhood in his mid-30s. You were learning so much at age 11 and having to adapt very fast to a different way of life in England. And I literally couldn't afford to go to Sri Lanka. It was something very present in his psyche, but also in a pragmatic way, it was impossible for him to make that journey to see his father. I'd lost my childhood. So I had to reinvent it. Going to places starts you remembering things. And I think all our participants today are going to touch upon various aspects of how Michael Ondaatje attempts to do that in Running in the Family. Next one, please. So just to let you know that Michael Ondaatje was a filmmaker first, a poet first, and he says, I think in images. And these are his words, it's not Wordsworth, but it's jazz. While in England, he says, at least 2 times a week, he snuck out and went to a jazz bar so that he could enjoy the dancing and he enjoyed the music. He talks about his partner, Anthony Minghella, his partner in the English Patient. Minghella is the director. And he says that even Minghella had confessed that to write a script or to concentrate on making the film, Minghella had to have music. According to Michael Ondaatje, he says, of all the arts, jazz is the one I envy the most. It's communal, it's free, you can improvise. If I could be Fats Waller, I wouldn't be writing. So that's an alternative that he would choose very easily. The way jazz spoke to him was emblazoned in his poetry. He says that he had a teacher in university who read poetry so beautifully, with such resonance, that when Michael began to write poetry, it worked on him. And he says it was a great experience to hear that even when his university days were over. Next one, please, Gurudash. So once again, I want to point out that if Christopher Ondaatje gave us the South Asian Gallery worth $2 million in Toronto, Michael Ondaatje put much of his Booker Prize winnings into the creation of the Gratian Prize, named after his mother, for Sri Lankan writers based on the island. Recent winners include a lost classic by Tissa Abhayasekara. His own uprooting has been matched by a restless creativity. He says, moving, you learn twice as much. It doubles you in some ways. There's a parallel between the writer and the migrant. In a way, writers are migrants, are immigrants. If you're writing about a new place, it's exciting and terrifying at the same time. A new land with a new language and new rules. Next one, please. Next one, please, Gurudash. Thank you. So this is just a pastiche of all that he's written and more. He's written more, but this is the book, The Dainty Monsters, the collection that brought him to instant fame. And both handwriting and rat jelly are the volumes where he invokes his childhood, his loss of language. In handwriting, there is that wonderful sentence, the last Sinhala word I lost was Vatura, water in a kiss. Next one, please. So the absent father runs right through as a sutra, as a thread that ties all his novels and poems together. Please, next one, please. So from the last few paragraphs of Running in the Family, I want to undergird the absent father syndrome as a syndrome which was evident in Mervyn Ondaatje, his father's life. He saw himself with a bottle, and the bottle was half empty beside him. In the bathroom, Anne's had taken a page out of a novel. A whole battalion was carrying one page down, forgetting the mirror. There, he saw the midnight rat. So I won't go into more details because we have many voices to share today, but I wanted to give you a very quick overview of why Michael Ondaatje has an appeal across the board because of his own suffering the human condition and bringing that lived experience to a realm which we all, in some way or the other, can relate to very closely. Next one, please. And this is the cryptic way that Ondaatje writes. There's humor, there's a cryptic, illumined sight that he shares with the reader. This is from Running in the Family. Down through a garden, clarity to leaves, fruit, the delicate light. He always speaks of the light, whether it's California in Divisadero, whether it is Toronto in The Skin of a Lion, whether it's the English patient in the desert, whether it's the Netra Mangala, the way the eyes are painted in that light, early morning light by the painter in Anil's Ghost, or whether it is in Running in the Family. So the delicate light is allowed only a brief moment of the day. I think that could be read as a metaphor for the light that he sees and that he passes on to his readers. Thank you so much. I think we will start with our presenters. And first on my list is Dr. Choitali Moitro. Go ahead, Choitali.
Thank you, Julie. Good evening to everybody, and absolutely a big thank you for that wonderful introduction. I thought the book left me thinking, and one of the main points that keeps on coming to my mind is that Ondaatje is trying to ask a very important question, which is the importance of not just father as a character, but father as a concept, and that concept becoming a part of one's identity. That's what I felt. And while presenting this central theme, you find many other important sort of themes which constantly play like rainbow colors in the background. One would be, say, the changing social pattern of the times. You could talk about the indulgence that you usually find in the pre-war decades. You have the war in the background where the whole idea of owning just a farm and his mother working in a hotel happens. So these changes happen in his life, and in between these changes, his sort of central mind, shall I say, is asking that question, that who am I? Who is my father? So even if we have, some of us might feel that the whole idea of this ruinous alcoholism might appear to be a negative for Mervyn's character, it's actually not looking at it that way. What matters, that's why I think the meaning of the text keeps coming back to us. And all this is done by a very, very cleverly textured narrative. And this narrative has a deliberate sort of subdued sense of heroism, and it tries to station itself on the more mundane aspects of life. What I will do is, I'm going to read a small portion from the book, which comes from the section called What We Think of Married Life, and the first bit called Tea Country. In this bit, there are 8 or 9 paragraphs. I'm sure all of you have read it. And all these paragraphs show the brilliant deftness of Ondatji's use of words, where he describes landscapes and he describes everything which is so close to the identity of Ceylon and his visiting Ceylon. But the end, this is why he's a brilliant author, a Booker winner. Look how this particular portion ends. Just let me do a quick reading. In the distance, tea pickers move in another silence, like an army. The roads weave and whirl away, bright yellow under the gray sky. The sun, invisible, struggles up somewhere. This is the color of the landscape. This is the silence that surrounded my parents' marriage. I thought after reading this, there can be no explanation. This is just something which you take into your heart, your soul, and you keep munching it once you finish the book. That's it. Thank you, Julie Di. Have I taken more time?
No, you've been on the money. Thank you, Choitali. And with this, you bring us to, you've opened the floodgates really to so many readings of Father. And I'm waiting to see who will be, brave enough to step up to the idea of what you mentioned, and then move on to Father and Fatherland, the intersection that comes of his revisiting to remember his father, which is in sync with his great desire, an almost Lacanian desire, to find a connection with his fatherland, which he left at the age of 11. So, Dr. Harish Mehta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Will you tell us a little bit, as a historian, about the burghers to which Michael belongs to, and maybe a little bit about the Civil War as well?
Yeah. Oh, so before I start, I'd like to welcome and say hello to all of us, and especially to our foreign friends, Dr. Jean Ewert, and from Colombia, Sana Hashmi. I don't know who else is from overseas, but a very warm welcome to all of you. So as usual, I get to do the history bits, even though I'm not a historian of Sri Lanka. My area is Vietnam and Indochina. But, Julie believes I'm a trained historian, so I can turn my vision to all parts of Asia. I'm going to talk very briefly about who the burghers are. So the whole burgher story begins when the Portuguese arrived in Sri Lanka in the year 1505. The country was then called Ceylon. And because there were no women in the Portuguese navy, the Portuguese sailors began marrying local Sinhalese and Tamil women. And the Portuguese authorities encouraged this liaison because it helped keep the naval soldier happy in a way. So those were the Portuguese who came. Around 100 years later, the Dutch arrived, and in the early 1600s, and signed a trade agreement with the Kingdom of Kandy. And then from the mid 1600s, the Dutch East India Company installed a governor. The Dutch East India Company paralleled the British East India Company, and it operated largely in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. So gradually, the Dutch began to defeat the Portuguese and expel them from all the fortresses they'd built across Ceylon. And in the mid 1600s, the last of the Portuguese were expelled. So that's how the Dutch come into play. The Burghers are a very small community. They were only around less than 40,000 of them in the early 1980s, and probably fewer today within Sri Lanka. And their language is that nowadays the Burghers descended from a mix of Dutch, Portuguese, and British through marriages. They predominantly speak Sinhala. And until the early 20th century, many Burghers spoke English and the Sri Lankan Portuguese Creole, and because that was the language of trade then. But depending on where they live in Sri Lanka, Burghers can also speak English and Tamil. So culturally, there are a mix of East and West, which reflects their ancestry. They are the most Europeanized group among all the ethnic groups of Sri Lanka. They dress in a very contemporary manner. Although it's not uncommon to see a man wearing a sarong or a woman a sari. And so, their music has found its way into this cultural mix of Sri Lanka. And it has mingled with Sinhala music. They even have foods such as love cake and bol fiado, which is a layered cake, fricadelles, which are savory meatballs, and lamprey, which have become a part of Sri Lanka's national cuisine. Now to turn a little bit to who the Burghers were. So the Burghers, of course, are Christian, and they count themselves as part of the Eurasian descendants of the Europeans and of high-born Sinhalese, and less often of the Tamils. Now, while ethnic Sinhalese are 74 to 75% of the mix of the population of about, I don't know what the current figures are, I guess more than 20 million. The Tamils are around 18% and probably less now, once the diaspora happened. Now, there are currently no more than, who knows, 30, 35, 32,000 Burghers, and the numbers continue to fall. Now, there was this Communist Party of Sri Lanka leader called Paita Kuniman, who had kind of lamented that the Burghers are almost gone now. And where have they gone? He said, all my friends and relatives have gone to heaven, or to the other places, or to the other place, which is the opposite of heaven, or to Australia. And there are very few of us left, he says. And of those who remained, Peter Kahneman said, very few vote for him because he's a communist, and the Burghers stand for a middle-class professional community with very moderate political views. So most of their people had gone to Australia, Canada, or England, and some to the US. especially after 1956. And so there's a retired Supreme Court judge, a burgher called Percy Colin Thome, who was the president of the Dutch Burgher Union of Ceylon, and he used to publish a scholarly journal on Sri Lankan history. He had said that the burghers felt that they were being outcast by the Sinhalese because in 1956, Prime Minister Bandaranaike had created a Sinhala-only language act. As a result of this, the Tamils felt being discriminated the most because they were the largest in number among the small ethnic groups. And this became one of the root causes of their grievances that led to a Tamil autonomy movement and civil war nearly 30 years afterwards. So the Tamil language has now been officially restored to equality with the Sinhalese. For the burghers, the setback was to be more serious in the long run. And the Colin Thome, who I mentioned a little while earlier from the Supreme Court, he said that we were ruined by the Sinhala Only Act because by then, English had become our mother tongue. And now there was another very brilliant lawyer called Charles Ambrose Lorenz, who was the first to agitate for self-rule. So the burghers, though small in number, dominated the professions such as the medical profession, law, and teaching, because they had this head start in learning English. So the Dutch, being a Germanic-rooted language, had the same roots with English. So when an English government was formed, this is too much Sri Lankan history, in the late, when the British came, in
Harish, I'm sorry, Harry, you'll have to wrap it up. Please wrap it up.
Okay.
We can come back to it again if we have time.
Yeah. So the burghers got the worst of it, because of the Tamil Language Act, and they faced intimidation. Now the few that remained, like Colin Thome, the lawyer, there are very few there, now 30,000. They stay because they have nowhere to go. They don't want to go because this is home. And some of them don't even want to go and celebrate Christmas with their relatives in Australia because they'd rather do it at home. They are a middle-class community, a law-abiding people who live in Sri Lanka now. They hate disruption. They hated the civil war, sympathized with the Tamils, but they ran out of sympathy for revolution because the civil war that the Tamils waged was endless. So they wanted peace, stability, because the minorities, felt the most relaxed and happy when stability was guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very comprehensive historical overview, which puts us in a good picture with what was happening in Sri Lanka and beginning to happen when Michael Ondaatje was actually beginning to write this book. He himself was going through a divorce with his first wife, and he says later on in an interview that it was the split of Sri Lanka that was coming that he saw, and that he wanted very much, the norm psychology 101 tells you is when you have a split in your personal life, you want to put back stuff. So putting family ties together was one way of processing the pain that he was going through and the fragment that he was going through. Anju, it would be great if you could pick it up from there, would be nice. Go ahead. Anju Munshi, looking forward.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. This to me appears like a story of finding when you have lost something. And the moment one finds a lost thing, there's an overwhelming sense of relief. There is gratitude, and there is also some kind of a pardon. So there is a sense of great fulfillment. Running in the family, I think, is a story of displacement, migration. Any migration, any displacement could be internal displacement also. And it's got an ambivalence and confusion that goes with, searching one's identity and homeland. There is a psychological difficulty in accepting a rootless identity. A lost childhood, faint memories, strings of attachment, mysteries, as he himself says. There's a mystery, in my recollections of my childhood. It becomes a kind of a baggage. It becomes a kind of a burden. And remembering incidents, the author is trying to remember incidents with disparaging remarks and about his family, about his acquaintances, and with a very deprecating roll of his eyes. There's every gesture and expression of his, which is beautifully written down by him. And these are all indications of a diasporic sensibility, which is crying aloud for attention, acceptance, and also protection. So basically, it is desperately trying to search for oneself. There is a kind of a crisis, and he's trying to look for it by way of, going back to his roots. And to be an outsider to your roots is a trauma. It is definitely a trauma. And there is a strange, the mental landscape or the ecology of the mind becomes a little weird. It becomes a little strange because there's a lot of guilt, there is regret, there is nostalgia, there is wishfulness. There is also a kind of a certain illegitimacy about one's being, which I think has been portrayed by the writer beautifully. There is a very strong sense of sorrow and sadness. That poignancy is there, which does not go unnoticed. And there is a kind of a contradiction. There are methods that he wants to come close to the country, and immediately he withdraws, like he talks about the fragrance, the scent, the rituals, the superstitions, the events of his native land. And suddenly he withdraws. It's as though he's not worthy of describing all this because he's been far away. He probably doubts his own authenticity of the details that he is giving. So immediately he withdraws. I think it's a story of resettlement of one's mind. It is a mind which is trying to fill up emotions, feelings, and memories, and it's rearranged and resettled itself. And how does it do it? It does it by remembering, by perspectifying, by justifying the past. I think I would also like to sum it up by saying that it's basically a reconnect with oneself. It is an integration with one's dislocated self, rather. It's more than a self. I think it's a dislocated self, and thereby, I think, reducing the impact of separation and guilt. And by the end of the book, I think it was a pleasure. There was a very cathartic moment, and I think it was complete gratification for, I'm sure, the author and definitely for the readers also. I enjoyed the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anju. Use of the word guilt in relation to dislocation and being an outsider looking in to a birthplace which he left a long time ago. That's a great point to take away. Vivek, are you there? Thank you, Anju. Vivek, are you there?
Yeah, very much so, Julie. Thank you.
Hi, lovely to see you.
Yeah,
Yes, waiting anxiously, eagerly.
Okay. Right, so I'll start a very good evening to all of you. I'll go and wade straight into the book. Many layers run through this very compelling book. Ancestry and identity, memory, oral tradition, magical realism, stream of consciousness, alcohol abuse, and self-discovery. It's said to be a postmodern memoir, but it relies much more on Datje's parents' and relatives' lives than his own. And he reminds us early on, I must confess that the book is not a history, but a portrait or gesture. In Sri Lanka, a well-told lie, he says, is worth 1,000 facts. Ultimately, the book suggests that history, in the Western sense of a single authoritative record of the past, is subjective and therefore unreliable by ignoring others' perspectives. The story begins with the dream of his father, chaotic, surrounded by dogs, and all of them were screaming and barking into the tropical landscape. The noises woke me. It was the new winter, and I was already dreaming of Asia. The author travels back to his country of origin, but Canada is his home. This irony is evident in the differences between Canadian life, which is properly Western and deeply European, and life in Sri Lanka, where completely different cultural principles apply. I realized I would be traveling back to the family I had grown from, those relations from my parents' generation, who stood in my memory like frozen opera. I wanted to touch them into words. In Nurelia, he says, everyone was vaguely related and had Sinhalese, Tamil, Dutch, British, and Burgher blood in them, going back many generations. The English were seen as transients, snobs and racists, and were quite separate from those who had intermarried and who lived there permanently. Emil Daniels, when he was asked by one of the British governors what his nationality was, God alone knows, Your Excellency. A vibrant island mentality predominates in the book, filled with storytelling, music, dance, poetry, and lurking violence, all washed down with alcohol. Ondatje's ear for imagery is masterful, not surprising for a Booker Prize winner, amongst the many other awards for his writing. I have sat down to meals and noticed the fans stir in all the spoons on the dining table. A wonderful image. His aunt's stories recreate the past. They knit the story together, each memory, a wild thread in the sarong. They lead me through their dark rooms, crowded with various kinds of furniture, teak, rattan, calamander, bamboo, their voices whispering over tea, cigarettes, distracting me from the tale with their long, bony arms which move over the table like the stretched feet of storks. And Aunt Peggy fluttering down the halls in her long black clothes, loose at the edges like a rooster dragging its tail. And Aunt Dolly, whose brain leaps like a spark plug, bringing this year, that year to life. He quotes Lakdasa Vikramasinghe's poem, Don't Talk to Me About Matisse, the European style 1900, the tradition of the studio, where the nude woman reclines forever on a sheet of blood. Talk to me instead of the culture generally, how the murderers were sustained by the beauty robbed of savages. To our remote villages, the painters came, and our whitewashed mud huts were splattered with gunfire. Just as Matisse saw layers of sublime meaning implied on the real world, so also Ondatje discovers the sublime layers of meaning on the same subject, the exotic green jungles of the East. The illusion is both transcendental and sublime. But truth disappears with history, and gossip tells us in the end nothing of personal relationships. There are stories of elopements, unrequited love, family feuds, and exhausting vendetta, which everyone was drawn into, everyone had to be involved. But nothing is said of the closeness between two people, how they grew in the shade of each other's presence. Hard language softens. I never knew what my father felt of these things. My loss was that I never spoke to him as an adult. Was he locked in the ceremony of being a father? He died before I even thought of such things. And Ondatje says in closing, I am the son who has grown up. I am the son you have made, hazardous, who still loves you. I am now part of an adult ceremony, but I want to say I'm writing this book about you at a time when I am least sure about such words. Give me your arm, let go my hand. Give me your arm, give the word. Thank you.
As always, Vivek, your reading and your explication of the text makes it come alive. And what I think you've done here is that you have sutured the time zones of his past as a child and his present, as well as the future, with that biblical image of Isaac and his sons, you know, give me your arm, let go my hand, you know, when you take an old person by the arm. So he wants to be the father figure to his father. I think you brought it out beautifully. And I also wanted to point out that he almost does a subterfuge. I think Raka Mukherjee will be talking about the poems and this idea of subterfuge a little later on. But Vivek, you've done it, you know, you've brought up that idea that he's going to people who are old now. His Aunt Dolly, for instance, can't hear. He's looking for evidence about his family history in places where it's, you know, it's not going to be found. So what is he actually trying to do? Is he trying to self-sabotage himself? That's a question that comes back to the reader. And he always says that he wants to leave his readers that option of finding an ending. And I think you have brought that up really well. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you. I was wondering if Olivia, you would come in. Olivia is our youngest Bengal Club member, and she's an avid reader. She's also got a very strong Canadian connection, lived in Montreal, and has been to McGill. So that's, you know, that makes her a kosher Canadian relative. Okay, come on in, Olivia. Olivia, I can see you as a participant. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, lovely.
Okay, thank you so much for that
You're
introduction.
so welcome. So welcome. Go ahead.
So the book, to me, it sort of conveyed a sense of a confluence of magical realism and mystique. The author sort of tries to use his imagination and his memories. So this was also observed with some other characters, like, let's say, Aunt Phyllis, that, you know, they're trying to relay the stories and the experiences, and they add their own perceptions to some of the events that they talk about. There's also a significant element of self-discovery here, trying to piece together his lineage and his heritage. And then, to me, I thought, as I was reading the book, sometimes the stories felt a little disconnected. But then I thought, you know, maybe this speaks to the puzzle that he's trying to put together with the history and his background, as he tries to get an understanding of, you know, his grandparents, his relatives, and particularly his father. And then in the process, he sort of gets a better insight about himself. While this book had a strong theme of introspection, it was also, to me, a lot about homecoming. For him to go back to his roots, go back to his homeland, connect with the locals, the culture, and sort of bring back or try to understand the memories that he has of his father, try to understand the kind of life that his father had. And at the end of the book, he sort of mentions the sort of guilt that he has for not being there for his father, not being able to spend the time with his dad. So to me, the way this ends was on a positive note. The fact that, you know, he's been able to come back home and fulfill the desire that he's had to look for his roots and his lineage. That's it for me.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you so much. Yeah, self-discovery introspection, and yet a homecoming. I guess in some ways, if I might say, you might have felt some of that when you first came back a few months ago, right?
Exactly. So that bit of it was very relatable.
Yeah, and it, you sort of what you said, I think reverberates with that idea that it's a lived experience for you too. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. Sangeeta Kichlu. Sangeeta, would love to hear your lived experience. Where are you?
Good evening, Bengal Club book friends. Right, so I'll take another aspect of the book, which I felt was, closer to my heart and my own first-hand experience. First of all, I think the unstructuredness of the book gave it a very unique flavor. The reality, which was threaded together with fiction, gave a very interesting mosaic. He was able to create his own childhood or his own identity. The magic realism of the book referred to by viewed the book, in fact, was very much a truism of our own lives, maybe a decade or two later. The life that he spoke about is very much what we lived through. We were born in the 50s and lived through the 60s and 70s in a colonial infrastructure, so to speak, in the heart of India, where you only saw white men in your own country. And we also came from a privileged, and there were a lot of privileged and promiscuous stories of parties, of alcoholism, of romantic liaison, where romantic liaisons were like the rainbows in people's otherwise all right marriages. So that kind of a life, which he speaks about his grandmother, that how he couldn't keep up with all his grandmother's romantic liaison, and then he refers to the cinnamon gardens. About burgers and what Harish Mehta said, they weren't Anglo-Indians, but there were a lot of Britishers who came. So their lives were quite disturbed because they also lost their roots in living in India. And that's why they probably behaved the way they did. Even they had a loss of identity. And I myself feel that having grown up in that culture where 9 months you were in an Irish convent with Irish nuns, and then 3 months in this colonial infrastructure, you're really confused about where you are from. And as Ondaatje says that, what did he say? He said that I am myself like a mongrel of place, race, of genre, of culture. So yeah, that's how he describes himself. So his contrasted Canadian life with his Colombo roots has created a lot of search within himself. And I, that's a subject that I related to completely. Something I completely understood. Yeah, and I think one more thing which I wanted to say is I think the father's angst, like, here in this, what we think of married life, he said both his mother and father were very well read and they read a lot of books. My father loved books and so did my mother, but my father swallowed the heart of books. Now, his father was also actually a poet at heart, but he expressed it in alcoholism. So it's almost like he passed all his angst and the talent down to the next generation, which was Michael. So I think Michael really carried forward his mother and father's missing into his books and his poetry. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. I want to take back with me what you mentioned about Ondaatje saying that he's a mongrel place of race, of genre, of culture, because this is a very common thread. If you look at Salman Rushdie, bastard child of history, they call themselves mongrels, whether it's Pico Iyer or whether it's Mr. Rushdie, or the diasporic writers feel that they are proud of that heritage of the mixture. It's not something that they undermine or they want to hide away, but it's a very salient point that you brought up, Sangeeta. And this is, I think, the core also of the Burgher identity that Harish first and now you have brought to the fore, because that is important. All the diasporic writers today, whether you're thinking of Kazuo Ishiguro, whom we've done, Pico Iyer, now you're talking about Mr. Ondaatje, these people are out of country, but they have made a country within themselves. Crucial point. Thank you very much, Sangeeta. Is Shutopa there? Shutopa Banerjee there today? Perhaps not. Then we'll go straight for our guests who are here, our guest contributors. And Vinod, Mr. Vinod Pillai, are you here?
Yes, Julie, I'm here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Julie, and good evening, everyone. I'll, to ensure that I don't stray away, I'll stick to my notes, which I put down after reading the book. Running in the Family is a semi-fictional memoir come travelogue that blends prose, poetry, and photography to leave the reader with a flavor of colonial Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, as a backdrop for a fascinating family saga. The story relies on research reconstruction of events involving Michael's parents, grandparents, and other relatives from the 1920s onwards. But Michael himself is almost missing in the narrative. Michael Ondaatje was born to privileged upper-class parents, but was soon tossed into an unusual, possibly troubled childhood. His parents divorced when he was 3. When he was 6, his mother left for England with 2 children, leaving his sister and him behind in Sri Lanka. They lived with uncles and aunts until Michael was 11, when they also left for England. Not having returned to his native Ceylon until the age of 35, the author's own disconnect with his native Sri Lanka, where he was born, as well as his father and grandparents, seemed to have left a void that needed to be filled. His realization that he was left with fragments of memories of his childhood seemed to have prompted the trips that led to this book. As he says, and I'm quoting from page 18, "In my mid-30s, I realized I had slipped past a childhood I had ignored and not understood." The book does not follow a strict chronological sequence. It follows a disjointed postmodern style, and that's interesting. The narrative begins with Michael's dream of his father and then planning his travel back to Sri Lanka, and then it quickly moves to modern Jaffna in 1978, where the journey to research his background begins. It then moves all the way back to the 1920s, 30s to recount his father's days when he traveled to England for his studies. Michael goes on to paint with words as he recreates the landscape and smells and sounds of a bygone era. The picturesque descriptions transport you to the location and lets you experience the events in the actual setting where they would have occurred. In the end, all the research he sifted through and all the stories he heard from multiple sources helps him develop a clearer, better, and more balanced understanding of his family background, particularly his father, from whom he was separated at a very young age. But in his own words, in the end, he says, the book again is incomplete. In the end, all your children move among the scattered acts and memories with no more clues. Not that we ever thought we would be able to fully understand you. For me, the book seems to underscore the importance of one's ancestry and early childhood experiences in building our personal identity. Even if it is filled with crazy events and flawed characters as parents and grandparents, our understanding, coming to terms and accepting them for what they were, can leave us feeling rooted and more complete. That's it from me. Thank you, Julie.
Absolutely brilliant. You know, you've brought in this aspect of underscoring ancestry. And that relates to what I think we've been speaking about, the indeterminacy of your mongrel self. But he's proud of that, you know.
Yeah.
He doesn't make any apologies for his father. That is something I find unbelievable. Throughout his books, Vinod, there is no apology. There is no feeling that, why the hell did you behave in that stupid manner? There's so much respect and affection and an almost a camaraderie and a feeling that this self that you say that Michael is missing from the text is perhaps because he gives his father
all the space.
Yes, all the space. So thank you for that. That's a terrific addition. Dr. Parumita Mukherjee Malik, are you there? Parumita, are you there? No. All right. Moving on to Raka Mukherjee. And then we will come to Dr. Roma Bhattacharya and Dr. Smita Kothari. And if Moitrey is here, then Moitrey goes after that. So first, Raka.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family emerges like a fragmented assortment of memories that the author presents, adorned with a gamut of sensory perceptions. My discussion today involves analyzing some of the poems that Ondaatje has ensconced in the retelling of his homeland and building the memoryscape of his family. The very first poem, Sweet Like a Crow, begins with a statutory warning about the lack of rhythm, pitch, and line in the poem, making a generalization of how the Sinhalese are the least musical people. The poem reads like an arrangement of uncomfortable metaphorical images that leave a pungent aftertaste after its recitation. The image of the scorpion being pushed through a glass tube reflects the claustrophobia in the dismembered relationship of the Ondaatjes. The call of the howling coconut, the rusty Bible, and the burning typewriter are all images that create the sense of loss, despair, and inability to coexist, you know, like a gradual destruction of a beautiful coexistence. There's a passage, like a whole village running naked onto the street and the tearing sarongs like an angry family pushing a jeep out of the mud. It's like a cry of liberation from the travails of coexistence in broken relationships, where they're forced to remain, of a family that pushes through, enduring the alienation in thoughts and emotions. And the final image of the anklet bells ringing as the poet wakes up from the afternoon sleep, it made me think of the last auditory memory, which echoes and made me think of an image like a scar, which is revealed after layers of cells build up on open wounds that the familial relationships of the Ondaatjes had endured. The second verse from Don't Talk to Me About Matisse by Lakdasa Vikram Sinha is perhaps employed by Ondaatje to unveil how his hybridity and diasporic identity that he has embodied and passed on to his children is a saddening reflection of the original Sinhalese cultural identity. The murderers sustained by the beauty robbed of the savages to our remote villages painters came, and our whitewashed mud huts were splattered with gunfire. The Western identity has robbed off the beauty of the Sinhalese cultural roots, and the idea that going back to Ceylon and enduring the weather conditions and the cultural traditions felt foreign to Ondaatje's children reflects the effect of lost time to which Ondaatje could only return in his memory. The poems High Flowers, To Colombo, and Women Like You, individually as well as collectively, construct the cultural diversity of the Sinhalese life that the Ondaatjes were detached from. The High Flowers, where the conjugal harmony of the men collecting toddy from coconut palms and the women working in the shadows, is an ironic contrast to the alcoholism of Mervyn Ondaatje and how that had been the reason of disharmony and a series of wrong decisions, alienations leading to his solitary death. To Colombo charts the journey to the fortress of the Singaria Hills, provides a broken structural image of the life, simple life of Ceylon, the essence of the paddy traces, and scooping the half-formed white of the coconut, having a taste of the country amidst the play of light and shadow. And women like you speak about the carved images of the women on the rocks that existed years before, and how men have written verses for them describing their beauty, which haven't eroded through time. The images on the cave is repeated in Ondaatje's The English Patient in a Cave of Swimmers, where the etched verses of memory reflect the timelessness of the lived experiences, which Ondaatje here narrates in his cyclical narrative technique. Finally, the cinnamon peeler reflects the sense of ownership and putting an essence, an olfactory mark on the cinnamon peeler's wife, a desire to achieve the tactile sense of perception. The desire might be the repressed desire of affection that was absent in the relationships of the Ondaatjes narrated in the novel, and maybe the smell of Ceylon, the lost homeland that only comes back to the writer in senses and experiences and recollection of the unreliable memoryscapes. And I would like to conclude by quoting Dr. Julie Mehta on her analysis of Running in the Family, where she says, running in the family becomes a tape recorder left running to allow a range of diverse sounds. And the poems here act as interludes to the remembered symphony that Ondaatje traces through his autobiography. Thank you.
Thank you, Raka. I'm so proud that you brought out so subtly the appropriation of the colonial subject's culture. And all his poems, I think, in some way or the other, talk about the cinnamon peeler's wife, which is a favorite amongst a lot of us, is again about gendered possession and the appropriation and the complicitness of the cinnamon peeler's wife herself to be possessed by the cinnamon peeler. So, this is also a very unique area that you have braved, because everyone moves towards his fiction or his memoir or his, other kinds of mixed genre works. But you've taken the bull by the horns and you've done it well. Thank you, Raka.
Thank you.
Jean Carroll, would you like to say anything, Dr. Ewart?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would like to talk a little bit about what Anju was talking about, and I'm really grateful, Anju, for the phrase resettlement of the mind. I first started teaching Running in the Family in 2000. I was at that point not a librarian. I was a secondary school teacher, and I was teaching here in Florida in an international baccalaureate program. Many of my students were fairly radically deracinated, uprooted. They had come from other countries, other backgrounds. They were in this program because it's portable. You can start in one country and finish it in another. The curriculum remains the same. And I myself was uprooted when I was exactly the same age as Michael Ondaatje. So when I read the book, understanding that I would have many students who understood this experience of being taken from a culture that they loved, that they felt that they were a part of, that they felt they belonged to, and being arbitrarily moved out of that culture by their parents for whatever reason, that they would relate to this book. And my students did. I taught it for 17 years in that secondary school. I want to introduce a term. Psychiatrists in the United States and Canada are starting to talk about third culture kids. Those are children who grow up in one culture and are moved to another one, sometimes because of internal displacement in the country, as we are seeing with Afghan children now who are being taken out of Afghanistan, sometimes because of their parents' military associations or State Department children, the children of ambassadors. In my case, I was a missionary child. My parents were Dutch Mennonites. They carried American passports, but they were not intrinsically American. And I was born and grew up in the Congo, where they built a hospital in conjunction with Médecins du Monde, Doctors Without Borders. And so we lived deep in the interior. My sisters and I were the only, we were called Europeans by the Africans. They called anyone who had white skin European, sort of as a de facto term. We were the only European children on the station where my father and mother, who are both doctors, built a hospital out of sun-fired bricks with their hands. There was no electricity. My father later imported a generator. There was no running water. And I had a blissfully idyllic childhood in this tropical country. When I was 11, my mother contracted Parkinson's, and they returned to the United States, where they had both grown up, for advanced medical care. We were not consulted. And of course, as an adult, I realized they had to do what they did. Although as a child, I deeply resented that I was torn out of this place that, as far as I was concerned, was my country, my childhood, who I was, and taken back to a United States that I had never encountered before, that I knew nothing about. Thrown into public school in Lincoln, Nebraska, a place where there is snow. And I can't tell you how offended I was by snow. And I'd never seen it before, and I did not understand it was cold. And then I spent the rest of my life getting over that. Third culture kids are children like me, like Ondaatje, who had to move, who was deracinated, uprooted, who had to adjust. Psychiatrists tell us that third culture kids have some remarkable strengths. They tend to be very open to other cultures because they've moved between them. They are resilient in interesting ways that children who don't have to move cultures are not. They tend to make friends easily, but they don't make deep friendships. They don't put down roots after that first time. They are anxious about being deracinated again. At the outside of their mind, there's always this fear that this thing that happened to them when they were too young to make their own decisions could happen again. And they also know they can't go back because those cultures that they left don't remain the same. Ondaatje's experience going back to Sri Lanka and worrying if he's a Karpota, one of those beetles that is seasonal in Sri Lanka that comes and goes. His niece, who is Sinhalese, calls the tourists in Sri Lanka Karapotas. And Ondaatje worries that he is like that. He doesn't understand the culture anymore. It has moved beyond. The burghers are no longer a ruling class. They're not privileged anymore. And he doesn't know who he is when he's there. Things he remembers, the way I remembered when 20 years later I walked back into an African market and the smell was exactly the same. The foods were the same, familiar again. I was so happy, but yet you can't go home again because your home has moved on. In the case of the hospital my parents built, Civil War destroyed it. The entire village was swept away in a monsoon rain 2 years ago, so I can never go back to that place again because it was completely destroyed. But even then, after the Civil War, no missionaries went back to that station. And so I spent 17 years teaching, running the family, thinking about that kind of very painful deracination. And I am in the process of resettling my mind. Ondaatje has helped me tremendously to see how one might do that through art. Thank you.
Wow, I'm still catching my breath after that. What a wonderful way to connect personal history to the history of the author and then generally to the history of deracination. Yeah, you've given us so much to think about. Thank you so much. And see, Anju, how you opened the floodgates. That was wonderful. Thank you, team. Thank you. Okay, after that, shall we have Dr. Roma Bhattacharya? Are you there, Roma?
I am. Good evening.
Good evening. Go right ahead.
Thank you. That was
Dr. Roma Bhattacharya has an incredible outreach. What she's done in her life, few of us managed to do. She's been with the UN. She is a DPhil from Oxford. I'll let her do the rest. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I was very moved by the last speaker because I worked in the Congo too, but that's probably for another evening. Well, good evening to all the Bengal Club, who's more like family now, and Julie D, and thank you so much for having me. Right at the outset, the two prefatory quotations signal to us that this novel is really about discourse itself. First, the 14th century European Franciscan's description of the two-headed geese on deeper scrutiny reveals itself as an epitome of a colonial view of the exotic, the Orient, the other, ironically and subtly interrogating assumptions of post-Enlightenment valorization of European rationality of the master discourse. Ironically juxtaposed and put at par with the comment that the denizens of Sri Lanka could not put man on the moon because of their poor English and the belief that the earth was flat. Irony abounds in Ondaatje. Another technique that makes this book very different from a conventional tale about a diasporic journey back to homeland and childhood innocence, is the expected narratives are constantly belied. The event begins with a nightmare and is not unsymptomatic of a person waking up in an interrogation cell, except ironically, it's salubrious Canada, the country of destination, the place of refuge, supposedly the haven of peace. Right at the beginning, we are taken through this powerful trope of the nightmare, the phantasmagoria compounded with the title Running. Is there in the title a hint that the diasporic is really fleeing and that the fleeing is in the present continuous? There is no escape from this condition, and the fleeing has been toned down perhaps to running to ensure a smooth international reception. The novel is about narratives, rather received narratives that are belied continually. Quote, no story is ever told just once. We will return to it an hour later and retell the story with additions, and this time a few judgments thrown in. In this way, history is organized. Is not the master discourse of the colonial narrative also a construction? In this way, history is organized. Ondaatje is a master of ellipses, tells his tales not just from what is told, but also by what is left out. The wind, the searing and the howling, Professor Julie Banerjee Mehta has talked about the audio text and written copiously about it. It's in the searing and howling of the wind where the diasporic can scream. She is the minotaur of the long journey back. Lots of egregious images that are ominous and pregnant with violence. The diasporic can only speak through illusion and ellipsis of his experience of the violence of the self, of identity and life experience. The entire Cambridge narrative, the Cambridge years as we read in the biographies of the distinguished, the high academic achievement, even marriage into the high society of the Roslips. This narrative is continually interrupted and belied in Mervyn Ondaatje, so that the reader can't unpick the puzzle. Mervyn Ondaatje takes up a huge portion of the journey back. The reader's expectation that the anguish of the diasporic will be peeled away to reveal warm Sri Lankan family bonds are belied by the anguish of a denied childhood, where even the primary relationships exist within fracture, violence, silence and absence. Only the mangosteen tree, which I practically lived in as a child during its season of fruit, was full and strong. In this unrelenting novel, there is some relenting in the poetic description of Sri Lankan nature and the oceanscape. I want to sit down with someone and talk with utter directness. I want to talk to all the lost history. That's the point of the novel. All diasporic history is lost, like pieces of paper flushed down a drain. In Canada, we hear the cassette playing the sounds of the Sri Lankan jungle. The multi-layered levels of forced displacement includes the sounds as well. The Sri Lankan forest is reduced to a cassette player in a sanitized Canadian kitchen. Finally, my point is about the unstable self. It is not just memory that is unstable, but the self itself. Already in this novel, I can see the bandaged, inscrutable identity of the English patient. So the self itself reveals itself in fleeting glimpses through wisps of smoke. The novel captures the flotsam and jetsam of phenomena and deliberately eschews the linearity of logic and meaning. It is almost more authentic to capture the ephemera that is life, for at an ontological level, at the heart of the diasporic existence is the shifting self and the illusory nature of meaning and narratives. Nothing is but what is not. Thank you.
Dazzling, dazzling, inventive, provocative. And I think Homi Bhabha would be very proud of you, Dr. Bhattacharya, because you brought in that in between ellipses, lapses, and hollows. Between the lines is where Ondaatje's magic lies. Between the bars of music, it is in those silences that I think the reader gets to hear and connect with Ondaatje's diasporic self, which is never, I think, going to be a whole. But he always says that it is this, as does Rushdie. If you remember, Roma, that beautiful image of the broken mirror.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Is even more rich in its wealth of perspectives. And that is what you've brought to the fore today. That space of possibility comes between the cadences of music. And that loss will probably never be made up. Thank you so much, Roma.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Smita Kothari, are you there?
Recording in progress.
Smita, I can see your name here. Are you there?
Sorry, Julie. Thank you so much for this opportunity. As always, your erudite introductions to the novels and being at the tail end of these discussions, just following all these amazing arguments is just, I'm just going to speak to the richly textured novel with its musical cadences and its evocations of these pictures of a tropical island that just resonated. And the book, on a personal level, as one who's lived in the diaspora pretty much, well, not pretty much, my entire adult life. And just as, I think it's Jean who speaks about deracinations, but one doesn't need to leave one's own country to feel that. When she was speaking, it brought back memories of moving from the west coast of India at the age of 14, the only home I knew, to the East Coast, to Patna, where fitting in was as traumatic as ever. And being in the first Hindi class where the teacher asked me my name in Hindi, and I responded in English because I wasn't comfortable. And her response was, Hindi ka class hai, kam se kam Hindi mein bola kijiye, which sort of put me in my place, but I'm digressing. Let me just, speak to what the novel did for me after a single seated reading. Running in the Family is a rendering of a textured novel of just the memory the fragmented memory, which is essentially what memoirs bring, and his vivid imagination, this magical realism that many speakers here have spoken about. And Ondaatje is particularly gifted, as is Rushdie. Both were evoked here. So what I felt, and it resonated, as I said, on a very personal level, he was lucky, I thought, that he didn't witness all of that growing up, because I don't know how a child comes out whole from that. I often thought about my own family as I was reading the novel. And the more colorful narrative of the two rather illustrious families, his mother's and his father's, and their loving, it's intermingled with part history, part creative licensing, piecing the story together. He's surely a gifted writer. I made notes here how I myself made an attempt a couple of trips back while my mother was still alive, and she just passed away a month ago. The last of the relatives of the generation, I wanted to capture the history. My mother at that point was not interested in any of those narratives. So Ondaatje was very lucky to bring his child home and witness these narratives. Stories told from multiple perspectives. And what I felt was you couldn't make up a character like Lala or the loving portrait of an alcoholic father in the bouts of his drunken stupor and the mild, quiet man in sobriety. The portrait is so loving that as a child who had a father with a different kind of addiction, I don't know if I could do that. It was just, I'm in tears speaking right now. So I'll end there.
Smita, I know your story with your father. It's very brave of you to come in and actually share that, but we'll understand where you're coming from. Really appreciate that. You've been a friend for over 15 years, and you've been just amazing in your career, in your teaching, in your publishing. As a professor, you have always shown that extra bit of kindness. And I'm going back to Jean's point about the deracinated children and the strength that you carry. Hats off, hats off. The element of compassion in you, Smita, what I've seen, you walk the talk as a Jain. You really do. Thank you very much for sharing with us.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you. Moitri, my very bright ex-student, Moitri Chakraborty, are you there? No. Okay then, Ritu Gulati is not speaking today, but she has made some incredible points which I will read out to you in a few minutes. Wrap it up, Shebonti. You're going to get the last word, so go ahead. Shebonti?
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, Shebonti is our very valued and very sharp librarian at the Bengal Club. She's been here for nearly 20 years. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee Mehta, for such a generous introduction. Crisis of identity, which is a very common theme in post-colonial literature, has been wonderfully explored by Michael Ondaatje. In this autobiographical novel, the author visits his native place to reconstruct his family history. As he meets his relatives, he makes effort in understanding his father's life and his relationship with his mother. There is a deep sense of regret in the author that he never had a father figure. The absence of a father creates a vacuum, a sense of emptiness within him. The author also points out at a deep sense of alienation, the alienation that we find at Camus' The Outsider, where the author writes, "Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know. I received a telegram from the old people's home, mother deceased, funeral tomorrow." Filled with life and loss, despair and despondency, this particular work is perhaps Ondaatje's finest and most critical work. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Shebonti. All your points were like ducks in a row, and I think that's how I felt too. There is so much sadness despite the understated humor that there is running right through the novel. I want to end with a comment from Ritu Gulati, our regular participant. She's written it down today, so I'll just read it out. Running in the Family is a superb memoir of his ancestry, starting off with an introduction to a rather Gatsby-ish Mervyn and describing the beauty of Serendip so vividly through the poetry. its varying nomenclature, references to D.H. Lawrence, Robert Knox, and the colonialists who were there purely for selfish gains. It's a wonderful narrative on his birthplace and its innate richness and beauty through the lives of his ancestors. I loved it. I think the lives of his ancestors, ancestry, fragmentation of the self, deracination, the lived experience, psychology, all of it does indeed make this a book never to be forgotten. Thank you all for contributing so generously. Our October book is Obasan by Joy Kogawa. And I hope we will be able to give you a date towards the end of October so you have enough time to read. Thank you, my friend Selmi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Selmi from Singapore, coming in here. Thank you, Ritus, being here. Thank you, Sana Hashmi. Thank you, Jean Ewart, who really put a new spin on an old bottle. And thank all of you, Roma, Raka, Smita, Vinod, all our guests from the outside world and our Bengal Club members. Have a lovely evening, what is left of it, and see you next month after the Pujas.
Thank you so much,
ma'am.
Very rich.
Julie.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
Thank you, Raka. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Sana.